And yeah, it's always really nice to see familiar names and new names on the list here. And we're really excited this morning to have a presentation by Dr. Katie or Catherine Sansbury, and sort of with Dr. Howie Harshaw. And they've just published, so congratulations, this research in Facets Journal. But we're really excited to hear a little bit more about this topic of Canadians' willingness to pay for bird habitat conservation using the contingent valuation approach. Dr. Sansbury, please go ahead and elaborate on yourself if you like, but then lead the presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, John. And thank you for having us today, and also for all these people turning up to listen. It's great to speak to so many people today. So my name is Katie, and I am a postdoctoral fellow, and I work at the University of Alberta with Howie Harshaw. And we have been working together on social science research relating to NAWAMP for about the last 4.5 years, unbelievably. And the research that I'm going to share with you today on Canadians' willingness to donate is part of a collaboration. So I wanted to start by acknowledging my co-authors, so obviously Howie, who's with us today. I'm not sure if Dean Smith is here, possibly he is, and also Pete Schumann, who's our economics professor based in the States. The research wouldn't have been possible without the financial support of Wildlife Habitat Canada, MyTax, Ducks Unlimited Canada, the Alberta NAWAMP Partnership, ECCC, and also the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. It also wouldn't have been possible without support from our NAWAMP partners. As we'll get onto when I talk about the construction of the survey, a lot of people dedicated a lot of time to inputting to the survey, and I particularly wanted to call out a few people. So Pierre Aquin, Jim, who's here today, Deanna Dixon, Mark Glutney, Bruce Harrison, Andrew Wang, Dave Kostersky, Kathleen Moore, John, Katrine Poussard, and Corey White. So a long list of people were involved, and we're grateful to everybody for your thoughts and advice along the way. So the sort of start, middle, and end of this research is really wetlands and wetlands conservation. I have the honour of working, resting, and playing on the traditional lands of the people of Treaty 7. Our near neighbours are the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and they are the people of the beaver. And it always feels appropriate to be here and be researching wetlands. As you all know, wetlands are among the more threatened ecosystems on the planet, and people and wildlife, not necessarily in that order, depend on healthy wetland ecosystems. But funding for biodiversity conservation continues to be a global challenge. And so one of our goals for this research was to provide practical insights for practitioners and policymakers looking to widen the base of financial support for wetlands conservation. The second motivation or anchor for the research is NAWAMP's Goal 3, so growing the number of waterfowl hunters, other conservationists and citizens who enjoy and actively support waterfowl and wetlands conservation. Goal 3, which was established in 2012, created the challenge of identifying people who are interested in and willing to take action to support wetlands and waterfowl conservation. And assessing people's willingness to donate and factors that might influence willingness to donate is one way to support the goal. So in support of Goal 3, Howie was funded to design and implement a national survey of Canadians, with my help, about bird and habitat conservation with a particular focus on wetland environments. The final survey included around 10 topics, which ranged from wetlands familiarity and visitation habits, preferences for conservation of wetlands, conservation involvement, activities, donations, and nature-based recreation characteristics. And today we're going to focus just on the part of the survey that speaks to donations. The process for designing the survey was lengthy, as I've already alluded to. So we held 14 workshops with NAWANT partners from bird conservation organisations and federal provincial government bodies in the summer of 2021. Subsequent to that, we held 3 focus groups with participants from across Canada to refine the questions that we had agreed to include in the survey. And then finally, the survey went live in late 2022. And we used a panel to recruit our participants, which was managed by Abacus Data. 3 questions framed our research. How much are Canadians willing to donate to NAWANT? How do Canadians prefer to make donations? And what do Canadians prefer their donations go towards? And we also wanted to explore how the responses to these questions varied with socio-demographic variables and also outdoor recreation participation history. So why is outdoor recreation important? Well, outdoor recreation is often one of the few opportunities that people have to experience and learn about natural areas. It's been called the window to the environment that many people have. We know that wildlife recreationists are 4 to 5 times more likely to engage in pro-environmental behaviours than non-recreationists. In the last 5 years, 1 in 10 Canadians went waterfowl hunting, more than half of Canadians went bird watching, and around a quarter of Canadians went foraging or gathering to collect wild plants for food, medicine, or ceremonial purposes. And so there's evidence that willingness to pay for wetlands conservation is higher among outdoor recreationists than non-outdoor recreationists, and that donation propensity may vary by activity type. The approach that we use to assess donation potential is called the contingent valuation method. It's relatively simple. It's based on asking direct questions about what people are willing to pay for a change that is beneficial or willing to accept for a change that is detrimental. There is a wide literature that evaluates the use and application of contingent valuation. Its principal advantage is the ability to estimate values that aren't associated with use, so existence values, option values, the option to perhaps visit a wetland, or bequest values, the option for or the opportunity for, say, future generations to experience wetlands. And it's also useful for estimating the value of states of the world that are yet to transpire, which is particularly useful for policymakers to test different scenarios. It's also very easy to implement and also easy to understand for people responding to the survey. But the main disadvantage stems from the biases that might be introduced from the hypothetical and non-binding nature of the question. Because people don't have to give any commitment beyond the time it takes to complete the survey or that particular question, stated responses might differ from the behaviours that would take place in practice. And we always kind of have to bear this in mind when we're evaluating the results. There's a lot of recommendations about ways to minimise those biases, and we've taken those on board as part of the research that we're talking about today. Things like reminding people of their existing financial commitments, of other opportunities, in this case to support conservation, and also measuring how confident people are about their responses and only including people that are very certain in the response that they've given. But overall, it remains that there are a few other options for assessing non-use values or hypothetical values beyond stated preference methods like contingent valuation. And it's been used tens of thousands of times over the last 60 years to understand the value of species, habitats, and environmental management alternatives around the globe. What does the question look like? This was the survey page that people completed. I'll just zoom into a few different sections. So it begins with a context statement, in this case explaining what NAWANT is and what its partner organisations work to do. So we provided some background on the North American Waterfowl Management Plan as an international partnership established in 1986. We explained some of the bird habitat initiatives that are undertaken, such as buying land, monitoring birds, and working with private landowners. We then ask a relatively straightforward question: would you be willing to donate money to NAWAMP? We reminded people, when thinking about how to answer, to consider what they would really and truly be able to do, bearing in mind their household obligations, and also reminded them of other opportunities to support conservation initiatives. We then provided them with a question that was, would they be willing to make a one-time donation of X to NAWAMP? And that value varied between participants. So we established the lower and upper bounds of the donation amounts in the focus groups that we held as part of preparing the survey. And in the end, we had 8 different donation values that people might have been offered in the survey. And these were offered at random to survey participants. So they might have been asked to donate $1, $10, $25, $50, $75, $100, $150, or $200. And those values were refined after some initial soft launch of the survey. So we collected a number of participants, checked how the responses were going, and then we made some adjustments as necessary to make sure that we'd established the right upper and lower levels for donations. And then the other thing that we did was ask people how confident they were about their decision on a scale of 1 to 6. And we only included the people in the analysis who said that they were confident, so rated their confidence levels of 4 or above. After we asked them whether they were willing to donate, they then were filtered through some subsequent questions. So the people who said no, they weren't willing to donate, were then asked why not. And the people who said yes were then offered questions about a preferred donation mechanism and what they would prefer the money to go towards. So as I said, the survey launched in late 2022. The sample was stratified by joint venture region and also gender and age. And we made sure that we had sufficient sample from the 4 joint venture regions, including the Western Boreal Forest, in order to carry out the analysis and be able to look at joint venture location as a variable within our models. So overall, 2,324 individuals completed the relevant questions in the survey and were confident about their contingent valuation responses. The average age was almost 48 years, and there were marginally more females than males in the responses. The average income was slightly below the Canadian average, which we considered would make the donation estimates more conservative. And around 7% were familiar with NAWAMP before the survey. In terms of their outdoor recreation history, around a third had not participated in the 3 activities that we asked them about. Bird watching was the most common activity that was engaged in. Around a quarter had been foraging, and hunting was around 10%, so about the national average. When we break down the willingness to pay, overall, the willingness to pay, so 32% of people said that they would be willing to donate some amount to NAWAMP. And this table shows you, for different levels of donation, the numbers of yeses, how many times it was offered, and then the proportion of people that said yes at each level. So what we can see here is that kind of below $25, almost 50% of people said yes, which is interesting from the point of view of considering, the opportunity of implementing mechanisms to collect donations that have kind of very small scale change, perhaps at point of sale, because it looks like there's potentially quite a lot of appetite for doing that, given the willingness to donate is so high at the kind of $1 to $2 level. We modelled willingness to pay in 3 different ways. First model had no outdoor recreation or socio-demographic variables included, and then 2 separate models that included income and other activities. Overall, our preferred model had an average willingness to pay of around $33. And that estimate is consistent kind of through all of our models. We also found there was a consistent association between bird watching alone or in combination with other activities and willingness to pay. So people who had engaged in bird watching were more likely to donate to NAWAMP. And there was a cumulative effect of outdoor recreation participation and willingness to pay. So the highest willingness to pay was associated with participation in all 3 activities. We found that there was an effect of gathering on willingness to pay compared to people who didn't participate in outdoor recreation. And this was strengthened when people had both been bird watching and gathering, but not necessarily when they'd been hunting and gathering in the past. We didn't find an association of waterfowl hunting on its own and willingness to pay, i.e. waterfowl hunters were not more likely than the general public to donate to NAWAMP, but we did find an association when people had also been bird watching. And we didn't identify any other socio-demographic variable effects on willingness to pay, except for income. Why did people decline to donate? The most common reason was that they couldn't afford to pay. This is what we'd expect and hope to see. We had just under 10% of people said they didn't believe the money would be used effectively. This is what we call a protest vote. So it's not that people aren't willing to pay, it's that they don't want to give the money to that particular source because they don't believe that it will be used properly. So that's kind of identifying trust issues, if you like. About 6% of people said they'd already donated to conservation organisations, and relatively small proportions said either it's not my responsibility to support the conservation of birds and their habitats in Canada, or that they didn't believe that birds and their habitats needed additional protection or management. Interestingly, waterfowl hunters were more likely to have given these last 2 responses or to say that the money would not be used effectively. This is interesting because we've been trying to kind of think about the reasons for this. I should kind of give a caution. Obviously, 3% and 1% are low proportions, and we know that waterfowl hunters made up a relatively small proportion of the sample overall, some 10%. So we're talking about very small numbers of people here, and this is something that we feel warrants kind of further investigation to try and understand some of the reasons that we've come up with for why waterfowl hunters might have been more likely to say this. Could be their experience on hunting trips. If they find that there's sufficient birds to shoot to have a satisfactory day, then perhaps they wouldn't feel that birds and their habitats need protection or management. Equally, if they feel that their duck stamp is going towards wetland and waterfowl conservation, then they might not feel that they have any further responsibility to support conservation of birds and their habitats in Canada. So sort of more kind of, this was quite thought-provoking for us, and certainly an avenue of future research that we want to follow up on. The other category here was quite large, and that was made up largely of people who either wanted more information or time to research NAWAMP before making a decision, people who wanted to make non-financial contributions like volunteering, or the time of year didn't work for them, and there was also kind of quite a large contingent of people who had other financial priorities. This was the preferences for mechanisms for donating to NAWAMP. This was interesting because it was quite evenly spread between the options. The options that we included were kind of something that we proposed to the focus groups, and then they identified other options and talked through. And so the 4 were payments to a non-governmental organisation, a voluntary donation when filing taxes, purchase of a collectible wildlife habitat conservation item such as a stamp, and purchase of a lottery ticket. So payment to NGOs was the most popular, closely followed by voluntary donations when filing taxes. But the purchase of a collectible wildlife habitat stamp garnered around 20% of responses, which is, really positive when thinking about the duck stamp in itself. And we didn't find any statistically significant differences in preference for donation vehicle by income or gender, joint venture or recreation participation. So it was a fairly even split. When we asked people what their preferences for conservation activities were, we had quite a strong preference for funding the purchase of new conservation lands. This is interesting because it's one of the things that NAWAMP partners do. So it's really encouraging to see the support for that activity. The next three most popular, fairly evenly selected items were funding bird habitat conservation activities on public land, public education and outreach to increase awareness, and funding science. And then the option that was least preferred or preferred by around 7% of respondents, was funding incentives to private landowners to carry out conservation activities on their land. And again, this is interesting because it's something that is obviously important, particularly in the Prairie provinces where so much land is privately owned. We know how important it is for conservation, and it's interesting that the general public kind of weren't either appreciating that value or didn't feel that they wanted to send their dollars that way. We had quite a long conversations in the focus groups about this particular item, and some of the narratives that were coming out were things like trust. People wanted to be able to see the outcome of what their dollars were going towards, and they didn't feel they would be able to do that on private land where they didn't have access to see the results. A sense that private landowners should perhaps be doing their own conservation, and why should other people have to help them, perhaps indicating people don't understand the potential shared benefits that come from private landowners doing conservation activities. And then finally, there was a real kind of sense of people separating in their head where conservation happens in the kind of public land or wild spaces and where people are, and that land that people use is for people, and that land that is wild is for animals. So all of those kind of insights from the focus groups are sort of helping us think about hypotheses for why people might find supporting conservation on private land less important. But either way, we need to do more research, I think, to really kind of unpack that and get to the bottom of it, which I think is important given how important private landowners are to NAWAMP partner organisations. So what are the implications for or arising from this research? So I think the first thing that kind of stood out to us was that overall, there's really strong support for NAWAMP and NAWAMP style conservation action, with around 30% of Canadians being willing to support NAWAMP, which, given how few people were aware of NAWAMP before the survey, I think is really positive. And equally, the very strong support for the kinds of things that NAWAMP partners do, with the exception of incentivising private landowners, is really encouraging. The second implication is there's obviously opportunity here to explore different ways of engaging people to give financial support to NAWAMP. We already have the Wildlife Habitat Canada stamp. We know that's around 1/3 of the one-time donation potential that Canadians said they were prepared to give in this survey. So what other mechanisms might be viable in order to secure more financial support for what NAWAMP is doing? The third one was the cumulative effects of outdoor recreation activities. We've seen kind of clearly that people who engage in bird watching in particular are more likely to give to conservation activities like NAWAMP. And so and harness that information in order to solicit more donations without kind of leading to donation fatigue. And then finally, waterfowl hunters, we feel there's more to understand there about their perspectives on waterfowl conservation and how we can best engage with them. So we have a number of pieces of associated research that are either in train, about to start, or kind of what we're hoping to do in future. The first is that we do have funding for a follow-up project on how waterfowl hunters conceptualise conservation, which is funded by Wildlife Habitat Canada and will be carrying out this year. And we're really hoping to dig into some of the questions that this research raised about willingness to donate. We also have a paper on bird watchers and their trip preferences using a discrete choice experiment, which is currently in review. This is interesting because it examines the conditions under which bird watchers are prepared to go bird watching, which could be useful for people looking to engage with bird watchers and optimise their experiences. We also have a kind of sister paper to this one that is in preparation, which is a discrete choice experiment looking at the people's willingness to pay for different kinds of habitat and bird conservation. It's different to the contingent valuation approach because it asks people to make trade-offs and choose between different habitats and bird conservation conditions. But it's complementary, and so we'll be excited to get that published and share with you all. And then we also have more survey data to explore on gathering and trying to understand a bit more about who's going gathering and what they're doing, when they do it, how often, outdoor recreation habits more generally. And we also have data on pro-environmental behaviours to explore from the same data set. And then a kind of future thing that we're thinking about is how we could get a better understanding of public perspectives on conservation initiatives that involve private landowners, given the important role that private landowners play in conservation. As already been mentioned, there's more details on the research in the paper that's just been published in Facets. I think Howie is going to put the link in the chat. If he can, or somebody will. So please download that, read it, and get in touch if you have any questions. We're certainly happy to engage on any of it. And so that remains for me to thank you all for listening, and also thank our collaborators again. We really couldn't have done this without you, so we're very grateful for that. And before I kind of hand over to questions, I just wanted to ask Howie, is there anything that I've missed that you want to chip in and say?
Thanks, Katie. No, I think you did a really great job covering things. Yeah, I'll keep my powder dry and wait for some questions.
Thanks, Howie. Okay. Questions then?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Katie, first of all, for that presentation. And of course, Howie as well. But yeah, lots of interesting information coming out of here. And actually, you know, my bias is I always love to see another contingent valuation study out there. And I think particularly with some uncertainty facing many of us around funding and the future, with some of the uncertainty and for various reasons, it's sometimes these economic papers can hopefully add a little bit more value or some strength to arguments we have about why we should invest in some of these conservation approaches. I did note that for a few people, it seemed the slides weren't advancing at the right phase. They were working for me, so I don't know what that says, Nicole and Pete, but I hope that the recording will work appropriately too, and we'll check that out as we move forward. But we'd like to give an opportunity now for questions from the group. So either type it into the chat and I can read it, or you can unmute yourself and take your video off, and then we can see your face as you ask your questions too.
I think looks like Graham has a question.
Yeah.
Katie, thank you very much. your stamp idea, and forgive me, a bit of a down a rabbit hole, but I was going through my dad's stuff, and at one point in time, you had to put an excise stamp on a check in order to send it to a supplier. You know, so your stamp idea, yes, it's a donation. What would happen, or did you investigate the stamp in its own right that has rights and powers? So that if you bought the stamp, if you wanted to go bird watching, then that gave you a statutory consent, similar to a hunting license, versus the inherent idea I think you had in your paper that you had a right to bird watch, and then would you donate in order to continue that hobby or private recreation?
Great. Thank you, Graham. And Katie or Howie, would you like to?
Howie, do you want to go first, or shall I?
I was going to say, Graham, no, we didn't investigate or put a lot of detail around that. We were just thinking about different donation options that people might be able to make their donation through. And as Katie mentioned, we did look at these through focus groups as well. And we tried to not identify mechanisms that were already existing, but that wildlife collectible did come up. We did suggest the migratory bird habitat stamp because that does exist. And there did seem to be some support for that. But no, we didn't investigate whether or not that would give people permission to do things wherever they wanted to. Sorry, that's not the words you use, but yeah, we didn't investigate that. But that would be interesting to look at.
So did the donation though imply better bird watching experience? Is that the connection?
No, it was just this is what the North American Waterfowl Management Partners are engaged with. This is what they've accomplished so far. Katie, maybe you could put that slide back up.
I think, Graham, too, there's the bird stamp, the stamp that has been existing for many years. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No, that's not. Maybe I'll rephrase the question. When you sell the idea of a donation, what's the implicit purchase other than the tax receipt?
Yeah, so in this particular case, when they were asked to donate, but they weren't presented with a vehicle. They were just asked, would you be willing to make a one-time donation of X? And they answered yes or no. So there was no, at the kind of soliciting the donation stage, there was no specific information on them getting anything in return. It was just presented as a donation.
Your slide kind of answered the question better. Is
okay.
That the intent is that I get better habitat?
Yes.
As a bird watcher, if I do or don't, that's the trade-off, rather than a benevolent donation just because NAWAMP's good people. So there's a implied purchase. Mm-hmm. So then does NAWAMP have to, or in your paper, did you discuss execution, that NAWAMP actually has to succeed in an improvement in that habitat because of that purchase?
We didn't discuss that explicitly. We had in the description that preceded the donation explained what NAWAMP has achieved to date. So we explained that. Sorry, I have to go. Oh, hang on. It's doing.
No, thank you.
Yes, so we explained.
I understand you've got a donation here, but then at some point in time, somebody has to deliver. Yes, the donator gets a tax receipt, but at some point in time in the charity world, you actually have to deliver what you promise.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for that question, Graham. And I think, if you explore some of that sort of literature too, again, there is a hypothetical market, but there has to be an expectation of delivery. And I think that some of the tracking reports for NAWAMP probably provide sort of a proxy for that might be useful too. So it's a good question and something maybe we can follow up, Catherine and Howie and Graham afterwards if you like to. So, moving on, Pete Joyce, did you have a question? I see you had something around again voluntary stamps and palatable to bird watchers, but did you want to put your video on and ask something, Pete?
Yeah, not really, John. I was just commenting on the idea. It's kind of interesting. I'm thinking it through, right? As a government official who's been peripherally involved in some of our permitting around things like wildlife research permits and permits for environmental assessment work related to project development and things. It's challenging to administer that kind of a thing. We do have some infrastructure through Wildlife Habitat Canada around migratory bird stamps, and a NABC type stamp that's voluntary might be a really cool idea. But yeah, it's way outside the box. It's a cool idea. I just thought that was my comment.
Great.
Like
Thanks,
you say,
Pete.
Worth exploring maybe.
Yeah. Thanks, Pete. Thanks, Graham. Opening up to others. Are there any other questions on this? And of course, Howie did provide the paper link, so you can read that at your leisure. But Tal, would you like to ask a question from the Smart Prosperity Institute?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, John.
Yeah.
Thanks for the great presentation, Katie. Really interesting findings. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to the point on lack of location effects that was in that slide on the WTP findings, and the transferability of your findings to different contexts. Like, what would be the limitations and considerations to keep in mind if we're trying to apply what you found to other regions with similar eco profiles?
Thank you. That's a great question. I'll start with half of it and then I'll hand over to Howie. In terms of the location information, we didn't find anything to suggest that people in one part of the country were more likely to donate more than people in another part of the country. And I would say that of the survey data that we've analysed so far, that's been fairly typical. Geographic variation has been limited. And that might be due to the profile of the people that have responded to the survey. We do have a mix of urban and rural, but it may just be that actually there's just other factors, other sociodemographic factors that influence propensity to donate. In this case, for example, income, as you would expect, people who earn more were more likely to donate more. And so perhaps that's more of a that is more of an influential factor than location. So that's kind of one thing to bear in mind there. I guess in terms of things to be cautious of, I suppose I would caution anyone against saying, well, everyone is prepared to make $33 donation, take that as kind of the magic number. I think what this does is allow us to kind of size the potential, and it's a way of thinking about where the potential ceiling might be for donations. When you multiply that number up, you get a very large number that's like over $1 billion potential one-time donation potential for bird habitat conservation in Canada. I see that very much as kind of sizing the opportunity and the potential, but it's kind of not the end. It's kind of the beginning of thinking about how you might actually go about soliciting that. Howie, I don't know if you want to talk a bit about the sampling and the generalizability of the result.
For sure. And just to say, the numbers are really tantalizing for sure. But I think we do need to temper ourselves for a couple of reasons. First off, we did use a panel. So this is not a randomly selected sample of Canadians. This is people who have signed up to an Abacus panel. We looked really hard at trying to figure out how we're going to get our sample. And we chose to do a panel for a variety of reasons, partly because we could assess their quality. Many of the panels in Canada also do political polling, and that gave us an opportunity to check their polling results with actual election outcomes. And we chose Abacus data because they were pretty much on the mark for the last 4 or 5 elections that we looked at. But still not a randomly selected sample. So there are generalizability issues for sure, and we have to keep those in mind. I will say, though, beyond the numbers, there does seem to be widespread support among Canadians for the kind of work that NAWAMP does. The protection of bird habitats, securing those habitats through a variety of mechanisms. There seems to be support for those. What's really interesting, as Katie pointed out, though, was that there didn't seem to be a lot of support for using donated funds for conservation on private lands. That's going to be a challenge, I think, moving forward. Not just because that's where donations might need to go, but thinking about the conservation needs and where these wetland complexes are. I think it highlights the need to think about how we message the work that NAWAMP partners are doing on private lands and the benefits that accrue from those efforts as well. So I would say that. I'd also just say too, in terms of the mechanism in the stamp being kind of a popular one, or a conservation collectible, it's quite possible that we could create a new stamp. But I think there might be some real benefit in trying to direct folks to the existing Wildlife Habitat Canada stamp. And maybe there's some opportunity there to think about how we might message that stamp a little bit differently to a broader audience.
Great, thank you for that question and for those responses. And I think that last comment you made, Howie, triggered a few things. So this idea around incentives on private lands sort of came out. And I know, Nicole, you want to dig into that a little bit more. I do see that Jim DeVries, you had your hand up first. So if you want to turn your video off, ask your question.
Yeah, so I'm curious what level of education about NAWAMP the participants had before answering the questions. Was it as simple as just reading one slide with some basic information like this, or was there a more fulsome description of what we do and how the joint ventures actually are the delivery mechanism of NAWAMP? And, did they have that understanding when they went through all the questions? It's been a while ago, so I can't remember exactly. I remember seeing it. But I think it seems to me that the willingness to pay, I was a bit surprised, but not necessarily about how low the foreknowledge of NAWAMP was, of the participants. So just a few questions, about how much information was given, of all the details of what NAWAMP has accomplished, how long we've been around, millions of acres, all of that the participants had before answering the questions.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. So the information that we provided about NAWAMP is the slide that's on the screen right now. I guess the bottom piece kind of speaks to the actions or the successes of NAWAMP to date. It is a bit of a back of the napkin calculation, trying to sort out how much actual hectares have been conserved. Challenging because they come in and out at various times depending on the conservation mechanism used. But we kind of calculated that since 1986, NAWAMP partners have conserved approximately 9% of Canada for bird habitat, which represents an area about the size of British Columbia. We were really careful in how we pitched this because we didn't want it to sound too good, so that we'd influence people to want to donate, nor do we want to make it sound, not as successful as it was. We really tried hard to pitch it, and this is something we worked really hard with in our focus groups to kind of find that balance where we provided sufficient information for people to be able to think about making a donation, but not too much information that might push them one way or the other. I agree, Jim, there's not a lot of information here, and I'm not sure that I would be making a large donation to any organization if I was just provided with this kind of information or this amount of information. But I think, realistically, the average donation amount of $33 seems reasonable. Again, we've only included those people who were confident about that donation amount as well. So we feel that number is a decent number to hang our hat on. But again, I go back to this general idea of just overall support for the things that NAWAMP are doing and the ways that NAWAMP are engaging with conservation initiatives and through their partners as well. I think this is definitely an area we could do a bit more work in terms of getting out the what NAWAMP does and getting a sense of how that's really resonating with people.
Yeah, that's what I see this might have legs if there was kind of a concerted communication strategy to all Canadians about what NAWAMP and the joint ventures do, conservation of wetlands and grasslands, and then having the options available like a conservation stamp, a collectible conservation stamp, etc., readily available, like gift cards at grocery stores, etc., where everybody, they see, they can make those impulsive purchases when they see them, and they have an understanding of what they're conserving to and what the benefit is. But there's a lot of work that has to be done to actually leverage a return.
Sure.
Absolutely. And I think just to say too, I mean, currently there's no way that people can make a donation to NAWAMP. There's just no mechanism for people to directly do that. And when we think about what NAWAMP is, well, it's a vast enterprise for sure, but NAWAMP is the partnership. It's all of the organizations that are rowing in the same direction. And this is something we thought about too, in terms of the strategy. We felt that if we named particular partners like Ducks Unlimited Canada or Birds Canada or multiple others, that might sway people. They might have had history, good or bad, with those organizations, and that would introduce some noise that we wouldn't really be able to account for. So by suggesting an organization like NAWAMP that many people hadn't heard before, it really kind of tells us what people's level of support is for bird habitat conservation, kind of regardless of who's leading that effort. So another thing to kind of consider as we think about these results.
Sure. Thanks, Howie. And thanks again, Jim, for that question. We will have one more. Nicole, I want to prep you up on that one, but just to mention too, the comment from Jeremy Hogan from NCC in the chat, just an interesting example from Fort Collins in Colorado, and how they have a sort of a small sales tax within the city to support land conservation that routinely passes with more than 70% approval. So that's really fascinating. So interesting to dig into that one. Nicole, would you like to you can have the final say today, the final question. Yeah, and this is a fascinating one because of the implications to, where the wetlands are and the grasslands are under threat on private lands. That's a big finding you had. So Nicole, do you want to elaborate? Or did you prefer to remain incognito, Nicole? Maybe you had to jump off too. But how about, I put that, I think, Pete, you're related to that too.
Yeah, I'm riding people's coattails
why don't
today.
you ride
John.
Nicole's coattails and you take it away?
Well, I'm going to invite speculation from our presenters a little bit. I do think that piece around contribution to land stewardship by private landowners is really interesting, and absolutely, like others suggested, something we can drill down on. Because this was kind of a panel, I'm wondering if you guys gleaned scientifically, quantitatively, or not, what's driving that? Did you get a sense?
I'll go first, and then Howie can correct me.
Sure.
So we had I mean, I think we were really fascinated by that. I think we had, as I've alluded to, we had some similar conversations in the focus groups. The narratives that came out when we discussed that specific, let me just scroll down to it. This one, when we discussed the specific wording, the framing of conservation on private land, I think through the three focus groups, it was discussed every time and iterated every time. It was kind of quite a delicate subject, and the messages, as I kind of said, that came out from that were, we really want to see the benefit of conservation action. We don't believe you would have access on private land to do that. Why should we be funding other people's land, conservation on other people's land? And then this kind of separation of conservation happens where the wild things are, and if this is people's land, it's for people. Those kind of were I think the three narratives that came out of the focus groups that, each one on its own warrants further kind of thought. In the survey, we had this question here, so where private land was least important. We also included conservation on agricultural land as part of the choice experiment that I alluded to. So in the choice experiment within the survey, which followed on from this, respondents were asked to choose between donating to wetlands, forests, grasslands, and conservation on agricultural land. And then different bird statuses and size of land that they would be prepared to pay to conserve and other things. And I would say the message from that was the same, that conservation on agricultural land was consistently least favoured. It's pretty strong signal. What lies behind that, I think, is where we've got some just so stories, but we'd really need to investigate that more. That's my feeling on it. Howie, I don't know if you wanted to add and correct me.
I have nothing to add, Katie. Great job.
So I'd love to offer a comment. I've worked around ecosystem service kinds of approaches, incentives, market-based approaches, so on for many years. And something from a government standpoint that I've observed is the value for money proposition around incentive-based approaches is a real stumbling block to making those markets function. And this kind of echoes that same takeaway, if you will. Governments, provincial governments at least, by and large, have said, we prefer market-based approaches. We want to see value for money. We need mechanisms in place that demonstrate those things. And it's interesting to me that you're hearing something similar, I think, from the public. I'd echo what Jim said earlier around, people need to understand and need to have awareness of, okay, if we do deliver those kinds of programs, what's in it for me? It's the WEFM of kind of the social marketing kind of stuff that we need to do right around this. But I think that is a real key linchpin in making environmental markets function that's been missing for the 15 years or so that I've been dabbling in that area. And this just echoes that for me. So really, really interesting work. And I agree wholeheartedly with those who say we got to dig down further on this and understand the motives, but also understand, how do we move past that and sort of bring the actors together to a place where there can maybe be some market exchange and support for the people who manage the land, and where the actions are appropriate and really do provide measurable results.
Great. Thank you, Pete, and then thank you for Katie and Howie for that response too. So, all right, everyone, I am going to use the powers vested in me by someone to conclude the workshop, the webinar this morning. So thank you all so much for coming and attending, and thank you again to Katie and Howie. We'll give the applause to you for the presentation and for your research. And we look forward to hearing more about all the initiatives that you have going forward. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming. Stay tuned for the May edition of the webinar series, still to be determined. So I'd like to keep you on the edge of your seats. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll talk to you soon. Goodbye.
Thanks for the opportunity, John.